So thank you so much, sir, and thank you for inviting me here for this 13th Renewable Energy Technologies Congress. And it's really a pleasure to be here speaking about investments. And what I'll try and do is maybe just pick on some of the points that you raised and what Popliji has said. But I'm delighted to be with all the panelists here. I think what I'll do is maybe start with some global numbers because it's important to keep the global context in mind. If I look at what has been planned by the major economies and countries and what they have shown in terms of their intent and the political commitment, we pretty much are at a number of about 100 trillion US dollars going into energy transition between now and 2050. But where we really need to have move, if we want to keep to the 1.5-degree scenario, then we are looking at about $33 trillion additionality. Now that number looks large. If you convert it into an annual number, it's about 4.4 trillion US dollars annually. So it's a very large number, and obviously this kind of investment will come in only if you have the policies in place, you have the regulatory and the enabling framework in place, because that's what investors are looking at, and the kind of risk analysis they do. If we're looking at what we see happening with the power sector, we are globally about in the total final energy consumption. Power sector is about, electricity is about 21%. But as we move towards 2050, we are really looking at electricity becoming the major energy carrier, where it will actually be the dominant energy carrier by 2050, moving upwards from 50%. So that's the deep electrification that's likely to happen, and which naturally renewables is going to play a very important role, contributing almost 90% of where the electricity comes from. But as we all know that while the power sector has moved forward and there is a lot of investment going into it, the end-use sector, which comprises of transport, buildings, industry, heating and cooling, not much is happening. I mean, the shift hasn't happened to the degree that you can see in the power sector. And that's very important because that has to also simultaneously move forward if we have to make it to the transition. Again, looking at the global numbers, the investment that is needed for energy transition, about 45% will go into the power sector, about 10% into buildings, because as we know, a lot of the heating applications come from fossil fuels, and that shift needs to be done. And about 28% going into transport, which is what Popliji was also talking about, a huge amount of infrastructure that will need to come through. But if you look at how investments actually function in the renewable space, you will see that as compared to the other conventional sectors, you still see a very large portion of equity financing. And that is a reflection still of the institutional funding agencies not making that shift. And public sector financing is really looking at playing the role of a catalyst. Now, whether that catalyst comes in the shape of creating a risk mitigation or a risk guarantee mechanism, which unfortunately we really don't see too much of. It's still being moved forward in a very linear way in terms of providing support and subsidy and all. But I think that needs to change. It needs to start becoming more of a catalyst and as a lever, rather than trying to look at it going as a linearly as a subsidy. But debt financing is what we will see really expanding. And so you'd mentioned that there are these oil and gas companies. Now, if you see the shift again that is happening, is Total, as we know, used to be a pure oil and gas utility, and but they've now actually shifted it into becoming an energy company, which is what they should be. I mean, why were these companies actually focusing on just the source that they were working with, and not opening up their their vistas into also the other forms of how they could actually go to the market with other forms of energy? But I think that's happening now. What's also what you can see is that this shift is happening also in the financial sector, which is very important, because it's the investors, it's the financial institutions, it's the people who are on the board of these financial institutions who are now saying that we don't want you to be spending money or to be providing finance to the fossil fuel industry, but we want you to be looking at the sunrise sector and how things are moving for the energy transition. So that kind of a shift where, I mean, we know that there are over 100 banks, global banks, that have made that shift, and which then allows for a much more of a liquidity to happen in this segment of energy transition, where you will need also what we can sometimes see, which is, when you see the solar panels and the wind, but what we don't see is also the grid and the flexibility. You talked about storage, sir, and clearly this is energy source which we know is intermittent and will need the flexibility, will need the storage. So if you're looking at the amount of money that will be needed for making this shift again, even solar as it stands today, and if I'm looking at the pre-COVID levels, then it's a 2.7 times additionality in terms of investments coming in at an annual basis. I mean, we've calculated it as almost 320 billion US dollars coming into solar and CSP. In wind, it needs to go 4 times more annually. And the most interesting that we often don't look at is the amount of investment that's needed in the grids and creating the flexibility to draw in these energies into our grid, which has to move from about 270 billion US dollars to almost 730 billion US dollars. So it's a huge shift that we are looking at, and these investments will happen only, as was very rightly pointed out, with the policies in place. Why is it not going to Africa? Clearly, these are, if you see even the IPPs here, they started with 1 megawatt, but they're all with multiple gigawatts, operating in multiple gigawatts in terms of their portfolio. So unless the market is large, you will not see these players go and make investments there. And plus, there's also this perceived risk. So these two things about maybe aggregating markets regionally is an idea that might work. Bringing in risk guarantee mechanisms that allows them to overcome that perceived risk and go into Africa, those are the kind of things that we probably need to look at. But critically, I think what India and the other developing countries need to look at is the shift that has to happen in the way we are skilling our young people. We need to actually move them to understand how these renewable energy technology, the energy transition technologies are going to function and behave, whether it's energy efficiency, it's hydrogen, renewables, or even managing the grid with intermittent flows of electricity coming in. These are all the areas where that shift in skilling, in getting our courses, our curriculum, making that shift to happen, because these have to happen alongside, otherwise the gestation is just too much.